So I wanted to welcome everyone here. I know some of you, but not all of you, so I'll introduce myself. My name is Mike Backfield, and I am part of the Lifelong Learning Committee at Temple Emmanuel here in Winston-Salem. And one of the things that we've wanted to do over the years is to offer programs which explored Torah and Torah, writ large, to include not just the 5 books of Moses, but also the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. And one of the most obvious ways of getting into that material is through the 5 Megillot, the 5 scrolls, because these are works which have been assigned to different Jewish holidays. So on Purim, we read Esther. On Shavuot, we read Ruth. And on Passover, we read Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs. And when I started thinking about this, naturally, my first thought was Rabbi Dr. Andrew Ettin, because he is uniquely qualified both to talk about literature and to talk about Jewish literature. And so one day after services, I saw Andrew and I approached him. And by what may be just a coincidence or maybe something more than that, he actually was finishing up work on a text on Shir HaShirim and had already done some work on the other 4 Megillot. And Andrew very, very graciously, and I may add, I was very grateful for him to agree to appear in one of our lifelong learning programs to talk about Shir HaShirim. So I think everyone here knows Andrew, and whatever I could say about him would be superfluous. He's been a longtime member, rabbi, Temple Emmanuel, and also in Salisbury, and of course at Wake Forest. He's done many, many things there. And so I think we're just very, very lucky to have him in our community. And so having said that, I'm going to go ahead and turn over the program to Andrew.
Thank you, Mike. That's very generous. So shalom, shalom, yerachot v'lo karov. Shalom to those who are far, and shalom to those who are near, wherever you are. I'm glad that you're able to join us tonight. So let me begin with a kind of rhetorical question, starting with a quotation. The quotation is, "Let him give me of the kisses of his mouth, for your love delights more than wine." And the rhetorical question is, what kind of a beginning is that for a nice Jewish book? A book of our Tanakh, a book of the Hebrew Bible. What a surprise it is to begin Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim, and come upon that as the opening line, because it is unlike anything else that we find in the Torah and completely unexpected. So what is Shir HaShirim? Most basically, it's a collection of 8 poems, maybe 8 chapters, totaling, all of them taken together, totaling in the original 117 verses. That's not a very long book. It's not a very long collection. Does each chapter constitute one complete poem so that we're dealing with 8 poems? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Shir HaShirim has a very peculiar array of content, very unusual and unexpected dramatic quality to it. And centuries after its composition, it continues to keep scholars off balance, to keep us uncertain and exploring and probing what it is that the text is really saying and what fundamentally the book is about. I said it's 117 verses, 8 chapters. One recent translator, Marcia Falk, who is a very good poet herself, as well as a translator of many Hebrew texts, produced her own version of Shir HaShirim, a translation of Song of Songs, and she managed to divide those chapters into 31 lyrics, 31 poems. So for her, there's a little chart in the book showing which of her poems relates to which parts of what chapters and lines in Song of Songs. So for her, it is anything but a unified, finished composition. Where is Song of Songs in our Tanakh, our collection of sacred writings? Well, it's in the third section, in Ketuvim, the third part of the Tanakh, grouped in a little cluster with all of the 4 other so-called Megillot, even though Megillat Esther is the only one that's regularly called a Megillah. But there they are together, often referred to as the 5 Megillot. Each one, as Mike said, the designated reading for one Jewish holiday, and probably there are 5 of them to balance with the 5 books of the Torah. When our sages many centuries ago were putting together a collection of sacred writings, probably that was something that they had in mind. Have 5 books of the Torah and 3 Chagim, the 3 pilgrimage festivals, Sukkot, Pesach, Shavuot. And okay, so each of those should have a special reading associated with it. And then, of course, we've got, and there sits the book of Esther. And particularly for our ancient ancestors, the next most significant day in the Jewish calendar would be Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of Av, because of the destruction of both the first and second temples. And so clearly for that, Echa, or Lamentations, had to be the reading. And there we have this little cluster. According to the ancient sages, we don't necessarily have to accept everything that they said, but according to them, Lamentations, along with, Ecclesiastes, along with Proverbs, Mishlei, and Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs, were all composed by King Solomon. I'll have more to say about that in a moment. But these were 3 major poetic writings by King Solomon. We're told in the first book of Kings that Solomon wrote 1,005 poems. How they came up with that number, I'm not so sure, but 1,005 poems. So it's not improbable that he would be the author of a book of poetry. And also 3,000 proverbs. So he was very busy, in addition to whatever time he spent with his hundreds of wives and concubines, and of course, the little matter of running the country. The title of Song of Songs in Hebrew is Shir HaShirim Asher L'Shalomo, the Song of Songs, which is by or of or concerning Solomon. Does that mean Solomon wrote them? Maybe. If you ask me, whose book is that, for example, I could say, well, it's Helen's book. But unless you ask another question or I go further, you don't know whether I mean it's a book that belongs to Helen or it's a book that Helen wrote, or both. So did King Solomon write these poems? Tradition says yes. Ask an Orthodox Jew, ask anybody who is traditionally brought up or traditionally observant, who wrote Song of Songs, and they will say, Solomon, of course. In some editions, particularly in Christian editions, Song of Songs is called the Song of Solomon. What does the title Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs, mean? Well, one possible meaning, of course, is that it's something like King of Kings. That is, it is the song over and above all other songs. It could also mean it is a song made up of lots of individual songs. And those of you who are familiar with the Renaissance sonnets by Shakespeare and Sir Philip Sidney, Edmund Spenser, and so on, will be familiar with that idea that here you have a book of poems in which each of the poems has a function relative to all of the others. It's like a story. If we jump ahead to 19th century music, there are books of songs by Beethoven, Schubert, Schumann, song cycles in which each of those songs is independent. It's a song that has integrity all to itself, but put them all together and they tell a kind of story. The story that is in Shir HaShirim is a story of passionate love. Is it passionate love just between two people? Is it passionate love between more than two people? Certainly at least two people. Is it about something other than that? And this is one of the reasons why we are continually engrossed by Shir HaShirim. It is very hard to say everything that Song of Songs is about. A love affair? Yes, most definitely. It is about that. It starts with that idea. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. That mouth seems to be filled with lots of kisses. And this young man and young woman, as they seem to be, have a very passionate relationship with one another. So, why is it in the Tanakh? Why is it contained within this collection of sacred scripture? Granted, it's shoved in the third section, along with all the rest of the stuff. We have the Torah, so-called 5 books of Moses. We have the prophets in the second section. And the first section of our Tanakh that was codified and canonized, made genuinely sacred, was, of course, the Torah. And then our tradition agreed on the Canon of Prophets. These are the prophets that are the ones to be counted and recorded and revered, and whose works should be read l'dor v'dor, from generation to generation. And then we've got a whole bunch of other stuff. One of the biggest collections of all of that other stuff that gets into ketuvim, or writings, the third of the Tanakh, is, of course, Psalms. people sometimes forget that there's, where are the Psalms in the Tanakh? Oh, yes, they're actually in Ketuvim, first section of Ketuvim. But also in there, we have a whole bunch of other things, including, for our purposes, notably, these 5 Megillot. And Shir HaShirim, challengingly and maybe problematically, part of the collection that needs to be dealt with. If Shir HaShirim is in fact the work of King Solomon, that means that it is a very, very early text. King Solomon reigned in the 10th century BCE. That's a long time ago. It's possible he wrote 1,005 poems. It's possible that he wrote these poems. But modern scholars are in doubt about that. One of the reasons why they're in doubt about it is that the poems seem to come together from different times in Israeli history, because the vocabulary shows the influences of a number of places in the world that would have been very unlikely, if not impossible, for the 10th century BCE. So maybe the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's favorite collection of poems. Or maybe it's a collection of poems that started out perhaps with some works by Solomon and then subsequently got added to, edited, what have you. The text itself is at times problematic. One of the reasons why it's problematic, I should say, is something that you will miss if you know Shir HaShirim only in the translation. And that is, in ancient Hebrew texts, we don't have quotation marks. Very, very inconvenient when you have more than one speaker. Very inconvenient when you have more than one speaker, because unless there is something else like a pronoun, masculine or feminine, remember Hebrew is very much a gendered language, unless there's a masculine or feminine pronoun or some word ending that suggests a male person is being addressed or a female person is being addressed, somebody says something and you have no idea whether the speaker is the man or the woman or some third party entirely talking about them or talking to them. There is no direct line throughout Shir HaShirim that leaves us absolutely certain about who is speaking, who is being spoken to, and whether what they say is to be taken literally or figuratively, and whether the text goes back to the era of King Solomon or whether it is more recent than that, still ancient, but more recent than that. It provides puzzles, challenges for readers and interpreters. It was true in ancient times. It's true in modern times. For example, hold this up, probably the best modern commentary on Song of Songs, the Jewish Publication Society, JPS Bible Commentary, Song of Songs by Michael Fishbane, which came out probably about 20 years ago. Excellent analysis of Song of Songs. Remember I said Song of Songs is 117 verses in Hebrew. Fishbane's commentary is 300 pages, plus a 30-page bibliography. That's pretty imposing, right? Most of us do not need a 300-page commentary on 117 lines of poetry. But the reason why it's there is that there are so many challenges, opportunities, issues, problems, perplexities in the text. So one of the reasons why it gets into the Tanakh surely is its association with Solomon. If you have a text by King Solomon, text written by King Solomon, of all people, the person responsible for the building of the temple in Jerusalem, how could you not include that as part of the Tanakh? So there was some amount, surely, of favoritism in saying, yes, of course, we're going to include this by King Solomon. But there was more than that. We know that the works in the Ketuvim were under discussion by the sages early on who were putting together the canon of the Tanakh. What's in, what's out. The books of the Maccabees, for example, out. We don't include those. Those are not sacred texts. Most other texts they seem to have agreed on fairly readily, but there were at least two that were problematic. Discussion over whether or not they should be included in the canon, the accepted category of sacred literature. Both of them were by King Solomon. One, Kohelet, or Ecclesiastes, and the other is Shir HaShirim. Is it really a collection of secular poetry? A collection of love poetry? A collection, one might even say, of erotic poetry? Well, in the cultures of King Solomon's time and later, particularly in Egypt and Mesopotamia, there were lots of love poems that were written. Lots of love poems, and some of them we could say were erotic, even vulgar, very explicit in their sexual references. I think we're probably all of us on this Zoom meeting are probably adults. So I can say, for example, one of those Mesopotamian Sumerian texts is a poem that contains the line, "My sweetheart, come plow my vulva." This is a lot more explicit than anything you will find in Song of Songs. What we get instead in Song of Songs is something richly sensual. Song of Songs delights in physical experience, in appearances, in scents, aromas, sounds, tastes. It is an extraordinarily sensual book, but it's more than that. Before I get into the more than that, let me talk a little bit about why we get Shir HaShirim for Pesach. there is one line that a number of editors quote, a reference where the beauty of the beloved woman, is being compared to the beauty of the horses of Pharaoh's chariots. Maybe not a metaphor that would occur to us as an expression of female beauty, but apparently, or maybe at the time of King Solomon, it worked. Right? It worked. However, also during the narrative, the storytelling of Song of Songs, there's a kind of storytelling within it. There are a number of points of separation. The lovers are separated from one another. They're missing one another. And from a Jewish religious standpoint, if you're looking for that, that becomes an image of exile, a metaphor for being separated from that which you long for, that which you most desire. But also with all of these visual references, Song of Songs is a book about spring. Let me see if I can share this screen with you for the moment. Share screen. Let's try that. Yes. And you know the English version of this, I suspect. Almost ironic given today's weather here. But, winter, of course, is the rainy season in the land of Israel. For now, the winter is past, the rains are over and gone, the blossoms have appeared in the land, the time of pruning has come, the song of the turtle doves is heard in our land, the green figs form on the fig tree, the vines in blossom give off fragrance. Arise, my darling, my fair one, come. Spring, in other words. And of course, Pesach is the festival of Aviv. Remember that at the time of Exodus, the month that we now call was called Aviv, which means spring. So it's the month of spring, and Sharon about spring, natural association. It's also a time when we associate spring with love. In the spring, a young man's fancy turns to thoughts of love, right? We all know the stereotypical connection between spring and love. And here is the lover, the male lover in this case, to begin with, speaking about his beloved. A garden locked is my own, my bride. A fountain locked, a sealed up spring. Your limbs are an orchard of pomegranates, and of all the fruits of henna, of nard and saffron. Nard was a principal ingredient in the temple incense, by the way, and also a major ingredient in perfumes of the time, and even perfumes of today. Nard and saffron, fragrant reed and cinnamon, with all aromatic woods, myrrh and aloes, all the choice perfumes. A garden spring, a well of fresh water, a rill of Lebanon. And now here's one of those places where in a modern text, you'd look perhaps for quotation marks. And a modern editor would have to face the decision, where do I put the quotation marks? The first sentence or the next sentence or the third sentence? Because the text goes on to say, awake, O north wind, come, O south wind, blow on my garden, that its perfume may spread. Let my beloved come to his garden and enjoy its fruits. Now, wherever you want to put those quotation marks, it's very clear that that last, the last thing in that poem, Yavododi Lagano, let my beloved come, may my beloved come to his garden. V'ochal peri magadav, and enjoy its luscious fruits. Well, what garden is being spoken of? Is it the garden in which henna and nard and pomegranates grow, or is it in fact a metaphor for the beloved's sexuality, for her scent, the aroma of her sex? We're in this passage, we are a long way from come, my darling, my vulva, right? And yet, very clearly, the expression of sexuality is so strong in this poem that the poem is sensual and, I would argue, erotic. It is not vulgar. It is not pornographic by any means. But it is certainly arousing to the senses and delights in the arousal of the senses. And as you see, or I think I'm right in saying this, and I hope you can perceive this, at some point toward the end of these verses, the identity of the speaker changes. It very clearly begins, a garden locked is my own, my bride, very clearly begins with the male speaker, and then it concludes wherever we think the female speaker enters. Certainly by the time she says, my beloved is gone and enjoy its luscious fruits, without the blink of an eye, without any kind of signal in the text that the identity of the speaker has changed, the identity of the speaker has changed. And this is what comes across over and over again in Song of Songs, where we're not certain whether what is being spoken of is literal or metaphorical. We're not certain whether the speaker in a particular passage is the same as the one in the previous passage. A different speaker has come into the into play. We have a kind of idea, and the kind of idea is that these are young people courting one another, but there are occasional disruptions, there are occasional setbacks. And at various points in the poem, we get the female speaker something that is very unusual in lots of literature, but particularly in early literature, and certainly very unusual in Hebrew literature of earlier times, a frank expression of her sexual desire and her romantic desire as well. An address by the young woman to the Benot Yerushalayim, the young women, the maidens of Jerusalem. I adjure you, I implore you, I urge you Daughters of Jerusalem, as it's frequently translated, Maidens of Jerusalem. If you meet my beloved, they're separated now. If you meet my beloved, tell him this: I am faint with love. I'm fainting from desire. Yeah, tell my beloved this. Then we get these passionate lines from the last book of the poem. Let me be a seal upon your heart, like the seal upon your hand. For love is fierce as death. Passion is mighty as Sheol. Its darts are fire. Fast floods can quench love. The rivers drown it. If a man offered all his wealth for love, he would laugh to scorn. Who says that? Who writes that? Is it Shlomo, King Solomon? Is it the young woman? Is it man? Is it some disembodied poetic voice that is sort of the voice of the poem over and above the speakers of the poem? We're not sure, and different translators, different scholars will interpret this passage differently. Or this one. I am a rose of Sharon, a lily of the valleys. Think of how many times this has been set to great musical text, great musical scores. I am a rose of Sharon, a lily of the valleys, like a lily among the thorns. So is my darling among the maidens. One speaker, two speakers. She perhaps says, I am a rose of Sharon, a lily of the valleys. He perhaps says, like a lily among thorns, so is my darling among the maidens. It's like a little drama, little dialogue that goes here. And then she speaks to him, like an apple tree among trees of the forests, so my beloved among the youths. Light to sit in his shade, and his fruit is sweet to my mouth. He brought me to the banquet room, and his banner of love was over me. Well, we could, if we wanted to, spell out the various possibilities of that scenario. What's more significant, what's more important, I think, is the erotic tension and the lover's bond that is expressed in this in terms of real desire. And then she has said early in the poem, Shechora ani, v'nava, b'not Yerushalayim. The very familiar translation is, I am dark, but come. The prefix, the vav prefix, however, could mean and. How about, I am black and beautiful. Daughters of Jerusalem. Like the tents of Kedar. Kedar would be a tribal area where presumably those tents would be made of goat skin, rustic, maybe even colored goat skin, or like the Riot, Shlomo, pavilions of Solomon, more likely a kind of canopy, a bedroom canopy of Solomon. So there is a beauty to her darkness, which is presumably unexpected, and yet shows that she is beautiful. And her beauty, of course, is celebrated over and over again. And the relationship between the two is so intense that we get to, in chapter 6, verse 3, Ni lododi, lododi li, haroe shoshanim. I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. And how many ketubot, how many wedding rings has that been written? Ani dodi li. I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. In its usual translation. A better translation would not be idiomatic in English, but a better translation would be, I am to or for my beloved. It's not a matter of possession. It's a matter of relationship, of connection. I am in relationship with my beloved. Beloved is in relationship with me. And then Haroe b'shoshanim, he browses, grazes, shepherds himself amongst the lilies. What's that all about? One might pursue that at great length, and I can tell you that scholars and translators most certainly do. We get back now. We're going to stop sharing for a moment. We're going to come back to screen sharing in just a bit. There are reasons to read this during Pesach. There are reasons to regard it as a love poem. We still really don't have a great answer as to why it got into the Tanakh. Tell you, as I mentioned before, that there was this dispute about Ecclesiastes and Song of Songs. And we know that there's this dispute because, for one thing, Rabbi Akiva, the great second century, late first century, early second century rabbi, halakhic authority, and mystic, very important, mystic, romantic, got into a scolding mood. And he said, anybody who sings Song of Songs in the taverns or treats it like pop music will have no share in the world to come. In other words, they don't deserve an afterlife. They don't deserve going to heaven. What that clearly tells us is that verses from Song of Songs were being turned into pop drinking tunes, and you can just imagine people in their cups of brew in tavern, men in their cups of brew in tavern, singing some of these erotic verses from Song of Songs. Akiva says, no. Very bad. Because to Akiva, and this is a passage that occurs in the Mishnah, so end of the second century of the era. Akiva said, maybe there was a dispute about whether or not Ecclesiastes is a sacred book. Maybe there was a dispute about that. But Shir HaShirim, there can be no dispute about whether or not that is holy because, and this is a translation of a quotation from Akiva, in the entire world is as worthy as that day on which the Song of Songs was given to Israel. For all of the scriptures are holy, but the songs is the holy of holies. The Song of Songs is the holy of holies. What an extraordinary thing for one of the great scholars and sages and rabbis of Israel to say about this text that to us looks like secular love poetry. Very sensual, very erotic. Well, two things that we do well to keep in mind in order to understand why Akiva can say that and how the text was incorporated and transmitted in Jewish tradition is to recall something about the prophets. Yeah, we read the prophets from time to time in the Haftarah, bits and pieces here and there, but we don't so often study the prophet anymore, certainly in Reform synagogues, in any great detail. One of the things we might notice when we read all of the prophets is that some of the prophets, in particular, Hosea, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, used the themes of love, betrothal, marriage, and fidelity, or especially infidelity, as metaphors for the relationship between God and Israel. In Hosea, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, we find God saying through these prophets to the people Israel, I betrothed you to me. I took you to me as my special one. And what did you do? You cheated on me. You were unfaithful. You should remember how precious you are to me. You should remember how much I love you, how devoted I am to you, how faithful I am to you always. So, prophet set for us a context for reading the stories of the love affairs or love affair in Shir HaShirim. And that, by and large, is how Jewish scholars, the rabbinic sages, and later Jewish interpreters have regarded Shir HaShirim, not as secular love poetry, not as sensual and erotic poetry about physical love, which it certainly is, but rather as a metaphor or an allegory for the relationship between God and Israel. And that, by the way, is how Christians read it, except for them it's God and the church, or God and or Jesus and the church, God and or sometimes God and Jesus, depending on the interpreter. So centuries of commentary have developed around Song of Songs, such that 117 lines of poetry in Shir HaShirim are like, if you can imagine a mountain being turned upside down so that the peak of the mountains is resting on the ground and the rest of the mountain, at the base of the mountain, goes up like this. I mean, that's the way the commentary goes on HaShirim. An extraordinary amount of commentary, teasing out the way that each simile, each metaphor, each image somehow relates to the history of the relationship between God and Israel, or the relationship between the lover of God or would-be lover of God and the object of that love, God. I want to share with you one one page that might contain material that is familiar to some of you, and to others it might be new. So let me find that. There it is. We have in Judaism an approach to the interpretation of texts is often referred to by the shorthand pardes. Back in the late antiquity, early Middle Ages, actually early Middle Ages better, through that period, the end of the classical period into the medieval period, in the Roman world, in the Jewish world, in the Christian world, and a bit later on in the Muslim world as well. In all four of these traditions, scholars developed a four-level way of interpreting texts. And in Judaism, pardes, the word comes from Persian and it means paradise or garden. It's an acronym for four different levels or contexts. And the simplest is Peshat. Sometimes you'll see Peshat explained as literal, the literal interpretation. That's not quite right, because in order to get the Peshat correct, you need to know the context, which is why I describe it here as the direct contextual meaning. And this is the way that I've been approaching Shir HaShirim so far with you. It's Peshat. It's a story of the relationship between two lovers who love one another passionately, sensually, and delight in the appearance of other, in the scent and the taste of one another's bodies. But our readers perceived there were other things going on in texts as well. Remez, Darash, and Sod, the secret, mystical meaning, esoteric meaning. And over the centuries, various of our commentators have looked at passages, images, metaphors, situations in Song of Songs and said, oh, you know what that is? When the lovers are separated and longing for one another, that is the people of Israel longing for the land that they've been promised, longing for Canaan, longing for Eretz Yisrael, or you know that moment of estrangement. That's like those times when we are hungering for God, we're seeking and longing for God's word, and it has escaped us. We had it for a moment, and then it seemed to get away. Or they look at a situation and say, okay, there is a darash here. There's a teaching here. Homiletic means teaching. There's a teaching here. For example, a bit about telling Yerushalayim, the daughters of Jerusalem, maidens of Jerusalem, don't awaken love this time. There's an ethical teaching, say, that there are times when it is appropriate to enter into a relationship, and there are times when it is not appropriate. We read that and we derive a teaching from it. So, Shir HaShirim, over the course of centuries, has become one of those texts that is probed and plumbed and mined, one might say, over and over again by not just Jewish interpreters, but we're talking in a Jewish context, interpreters who find in it hints, teachings, suggestions, insights, profound spiritual perception that one can savor and find deep meaning from, even when one has perhaps gotten tired of the love story, because you're, it's become like one of these movies where the lovers are going to get together sooner or later, and you're tired of hearing them long for one another. So there's that level of Shir HaShirim, but all of these others as well. So over the course of Jewish history, while it hasn't had the exact prominence that, let's say, Esther has, the book of Esther has on Purim, Shir HaShirim has found its way also into Jewish liturgy. The usual time for reading it, or one of the usual times for reading it, is in the afternoon on Friday, leading into Shabbat. Why? It's because there's so much talk in the poem about welcoming Dodi, the beloved, L'cha Dodi, welcoming the beloved. And this image of the poem as being about the lover longing for the beloved fits in exactly with particularly the mystical interpretations of Kabbalat Shabbat. The lover longing for the beloved to come, hungering for the beloved, can't wait, and the scent of the beloved, like the scent of Shabbat, is something that's so beautiful. And not only is the beloved, but she is also the bride, the way Shabbat is the bride. So in some traditional contexts, Song of Songs, it's only 117 verses, right? Song of Songs is read on Friday afternoon, afternoon of Yom HaShishi, as we get ready for Shabbat. The other time that it comes into the synagogue liturgy is during Pesach, and particularly end of Pesach. In Ashkenazic congregations observe and eighth day, half of Shir HaShirim is recited on the seventh day, evening service. Half is recited on the eighth day in the evening service, or particularly in Ashkenazic congregations, if there is a Shabbat, not this year, but if there's a Shabbat that falls during one of the intermediary days of Pesach, Song of Songs is read in the synagogue on the Shabbat, right before the Torah reading. And the blessing that's said for that reading is the blessing for hearing the Megillah. So it does, in fact, have a synagogue presence, though people in more casual congregations, people in Reform and less traditional congregations, less likely to encounter it in those terms. So far as the poetry is concerned, there are many, many translations of Song of Songs. Reading Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim, translation, is better than not reading it at all. One can quibble about this translation or that translation. Some of the translations make choices that I might disagree with in terms of how they assign various lines to particular speakers, how they resolve the problems presented by the poem, where we can't be certain who is being addressed, or whether a particular episode is literal or metaphorical, or even, as sometimes seems to be the case, a dream vision. There are a number of night episodes where we read it and wonder, all clear, is that something that the speaker fantasized about, or imagined, dreamt, or is it something that really took place? And it's impossible to say, which is a reason why commentators step in and try to explain, or translators will try to work out some strategy so that reading the text peshat, reading it, prima facie, what it says on the page, will make more sense than simply throwing up your hands and saying, well, sorry, too bad, we don't really know what the text means here. At some level, I think Song of Songs is a bit like a puzzle, and it's a bit like a mystery story. And you know what happens with a puzzle or a mystery story? When you get to a point where you're not sure how to, as we might say, the dots. You're not quite sure whether this is to be taken literally or figuratively. You're not quite sure who's speaking here and what they meant by it. And so one strategy would be to say, well, too bad, we don't have all of the information. Somewhere along the line, 12 centuries ago, or whenever, or 22 centuries ago, whenever, some piece of the poem got lost. We don't have the connective piece here. And I mean, that's a possible explanation, but it doesn't get us very far. It doesn't get us very far because it doesn't give us a satisfactory way of dealing with what we have. What we have is the text as it's been transmitted over the centuries. So another way of dealing with those puzzles, and this relates to the interpretation method that I was just showing you. Another way of dealing with those perplexities and puzzlements, say, you know what? We have as much of the text as we're ever going to have. There's not going to be any more that will pop up somewhere from the bottom of somebody's desk drawer. So what we might think about is maybe we have all the text that we need, but we need to ask different questions about it. Maybe we've been looking at it the wrong way. Maybe looking at the surface, peshat, literal explanation only gets us so far. And in order to get at the deeper reality, the deeper meaning of this beautiful and treasured poem, is to see it in a different framework. One of the teachings that interpretive practices have is that a text never loses its peshat meaning. You can do all kinds of fancy interpretive things with it. You can do all kinds of allegories and metaphors and symbolic interpretations and spiritual interpretations of all kinds. But the text always retains its primary contextual meaning. And so whatever else one might want to say about Shir HaShirim, whatever else one might do with that text, it is always going to be what it appears to be most directly and forcefully and straightforward, in straightforward manner for us, and that is exquisite, meaningful love poetry written by, about, concerning, involving two people who love one another passionately, desire one another intensely, and are not ashamed of that, are willing to express it, male and female alike, each of them expressing a desire, not only, oh, how I love you, but expressing a real desire for the physicality of the other person. And boy, to come upon a religious text, I mean, a text in the biblical tradition that acknowledges physical desire as something that is worthwhile and an essential part of the human condition, sense of what we are as human beings, that's unusual and it's special and it's precious. And I think, by the way, that it is a real gift from Jewish literature to the world at large, and in particular to the religious world at large, because it is too easy in religious contexts to say, well, what we deal with is the spiritual, love and our relationship with God and so on. I mean, that's really about the soul and the spirit. And in doing that, we devalue the physical bodies that we've been given and the significance that our physical bodies have with all of what we've got. The kisses of his mouth, the love that delights more than wine. Her limbs are an orchard of pomegranates. It's one of those metaphors. I mean, I'm not quite sure where you go with that, except to recognize that for our ancestors and for many of us, what is a pomegranate? It's a beautiful fruit that's filled with lots of good things. Of all luscious fruits, henna and nard, fragrant reed, cinnamon, saffron, aromatic woods, myrrh, choice perfumes, a garden spring, a well of fresh water. Blow upon my garden, that its perfume may spread. Let my beloved come to his garden and enjoy its luscious fruits. Yeah. I think the last thing that I will say about about that, and then invite questions, comments, responses, perplexities, etc., whatever you might have. Rabbi Arthur Waskow, one of my contemporaries and colleagues, likes to say that Shir HaShirim is a recipe for haroset. For him, this is one of the reasons why we read Song of Songs on Pesach. He says, if you take all of the fruits that are mentioned, all the fruits and nuts that are mentioned throughout Shir HaShirim, you've got I've just given a little sample of the text here, but there are dates, there are figs, there's wine, there's lots of wine in Song of Songs. Lots of fruit, and the cinnamon. Don't forget the cinnamon. Put them all together, and it's haroset. So I am going to stop sharing the screen and see whether there's anybody who would raise a hand, or I don't know if there's anything in the chat, but you're okay. Well, you're welcome to chat if you want. No.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Hi. Good to see you.
Hi, Seth.
The stone to knock, which I have in front of me, does not give, unlike most of the rest of it, does not give a literal translation, but it gives the allegorical, or remez, I guess, translation of Rashi.
Yeah.
And in the notes to it, it has not all, but a lot of the actual literal spelled out. And it's very interesting to see how what you were showing on Safaria, or what's on the Chabad website for Shir HaShirim versus what's in the Stone Tanakh, and how different they are, and how much context is added to it to support the notion of the allegory.
Right. Yes, exactly. So, thank you, Seth. That's a lovely observation, because it brings to mind that when every translator and every commentary is going to have its own slant. There's going to be a kind of apologetics for one particular viewpoint. I mentioned the fourfold, the pardes of interpretation. So, what Michael Fishbane does in this tome is basically to provide 4 running commentaries on every line of the text. And he starts with a Peshat and then goes on with Remez and Dorat, Sod, pulling commentaries from centuries of annotators, beginning with Rashi and Ibn Ezra, and going on through not just the Middle Ages, but the Hasidic commentaries of the 19th and 20th centuries, philosophical interpretations. He's got about a 15-page addendum in the back, giving a view of the history of Shir HaShirim interpretations. So that's his way of dealing with this, basically saying, what is Shir HaShirim? Is all of it. it's the Peshat, but it's also all of these other things. And you dive into one and you come out of it again. And then you go into another level, perhaps, or you say, let me follow that along. Let me see what's going on in the book on the Darash level, where there are largely commenting. There's some political commentaries in the Darash. Commentaries having to do with the history of Israel in the world and the prophetic comments about our backsliding, our failures to connect, our failures to be faithful, the times when we are chastised by God. There's a point in Shir HaShirim where the young woman is out searching for her beloved, and she is accosted by the guardians of the city who smack her around. And this is interpreted on the Darash level as one of those instances in which sort of like the Book of Lamentations, Israel is chastised and beaten by the representatives of God or the emissaries of God because of its failure of trust. I had once upon a time I had an Israeli teacher of the Hebrew Bible, born and raised in Israel, and we had people in the group in the class bringing in their own textbooks and their own biblical commentaries and so on, and somebody would open one and put something in the annotations, and the typical response from her that I remember is, "Don't give me Art Scroll." This is history. We're talking history now. We're not talking about myth. We're not talking about the projection of some rabbinic perspective or context onto Israeli history. No, we're looking at the pshat of the history. So the commentaries, we learn something from every commentary, but one of the things we learn from looking at a variety of commentaries is that no one of them is the truth. And the commentary that deals exclusively, and one of my complaints about the stone Chumash is the extent to which they rely on Rashi. And Rashi in his time was very perceptive and useful. One of the interesting things about Rashi, and I'll just say and leave it at that, is that Rashbam, who was another great rabbinic commentator, who was grandson of Rashi, married the son of one of Rashi's daughters and her husband. Rashbam said that his grandfather Rashi, in his old age, said that he wished he could rewrite his commentaries in light of the new information about language and Hebrew language and Hebrew grammar that people were discovering every day. And so, some of that was coming from his reading of Ibn Ezra, who knew the Arab commentaries, and because of his knowledge, because of Ibn Ezra's knowledge of Arabic, he could see cognates in Hebrew that would have been lost to Rashi. But Rashi realized this. He was not too proud and not too taken with himself to admit, when I did my commentary, I didn't know as much as I wished I had known.
Andrew?
Yes.
One of the
Oh,
things,
hey.
yeah, one of the things that I especially notice about Shir HaShirim is the prevalence of animals in it. We've got the foxes and the turtle doves and the deer and the horses, and
Gazelles.
Gazelles, right?
A whole lot of gazelles.
And it seems to me that you could reflect that the unashamed physicality of the lovers is reflected in the animal kingdom, where there are, again, no inhibitions.
Yeah, nice. You are a gazelle, he says to her. My gazelle. It's not only that the animals are there as window, or landscape figurines. Those images, those metaphors, are really operating. They're quite prevalent. I think you're right that the physicality of the lovers' relationship is kind of, well, the references to the natural world, particularly the animal kingdom, are supported by the physicality of lovers' relationships with one another. One of the other perspectives that is interesting to play around with is the fact that so many of those lines are clearly spoken. Sometimes we can't tell, but so many of those lines are clearly spoken by a female speaker. And how often do you get that anywhere in the Tanakh? We get it in Ruth, we get it in Esther. There's a little bit in the Torah. Here you get female speaker speaking of her desires, and it's we don't know for sure all of those poems were written by men. We don't know for sure that they all represent a man's take on a woman's point of view. So it's a fascinating text, and one of the things that makes it fascinating is we really don't have it all nailed down, and there is no possible way to have it all nailed down because of these, frankly, gaps in, well, they could be gaps in transmission, but they are gaps in the narrative flow, where somebody has been speaking, or a disembodied narrative voice has been speaking, and all of a sudden something is said, and it's clear that somebody else has come in and said something, but there is no machinery, there's no mechanism within the Hebrew text to indicate, oh, new speaker here. There's no he said, she said. Rather, you have to intuit it or discern it or perceive it somehow. From time to time, we can do this when there are pronoun references, let's say, or when there's a word ending, for example, that gives us a little bit of a feeling for the fact that oh, this is surely a female speaker rather than a male speaker. One of those places, by the way, where that disorientation takes place is in the opening line of the poem. I translated it much more strictly and literally than you usually get. I translate it as, let him give me of the kisses of his mouth, for your love delights more than wine. It's as if she has, she, the female speaker, is the first speaker of King's poems written by King Solomon. Maybe, maybe not, but he is the first speaker of the poem. And she said, let him give me of the kisses of his mouth, for your love. And then she turns to him as if maybe he's, if you want to do this as a mini drama, he's about to enter the room. She's thinking to herself, or maybe saying to herself, let him give me of the kisses of his mouth. And the door opens and there, voila, there he is. For your love delights more than wine. Now, you can look at a number of different translations of the opening of Song of Songs. And most often what you will find is that the translator has adjusted the references in those two lines so that there's no change between the first phrase or the first unit and the second unit. So they'll say something like, give me the kisses of your mouth, for your love delights more than wine. Or, let him give me the kisses of his mouth, for his love delights more than wine. That's not really what the text says. There's this little grammatical glitch in the text that we either accept as signaling two different terms of address, or else we have to figure, well, maybe there was an old form of Hebrew in which, old form of Hebrew grammar in which it meant one thing or the other. It was third person or second person, rather than first it's third person and then it's second person. And Shir HaShirim is filled with those sorts of things, not to mention the places where we are just not at all sure what a particular word means. The translator says, meaning of Hebrew uncertain. The translator says, well, this might be a cognate of this other word that we find in Akkadian. Maybe that's kind of, maybe that sort of sense here. Or maybe it's an older form of the Hebrew, but we just don't know. So there are those kinds of puzzles as well.
I know there's probably more to say, more questions and comments, and I think we probably coming to the close of our time. Andrew, I'd like to really thank you so much for all of your insights into this text, and your words have kind of given a new way of approaching, a new kind of basis for going on from here and looking at the text. There's certainly a lot that can be explored in this, and I really appreciate your sharing your knowledge and your insight.
I'm glad it worked out so well, Mike, and appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah, we should do this again sometime with one of the other books, perhaps.
I think the next one is Tisha B'Av, right? Lamentations. I think that's
Well,
next.
we'll
Or Shavuot.
we'll get to Shavuot and to
Yeah.
Woot coming up fast. At least I've already finished writing. Anyway,
All right,
I finished
well.
writing on both of those already. But yeah, either of those would be
All
great.
right. Well, if you're willing to do it, I think we're all willing to. Would love to hear it. So
That's sweet. Thank you, Mike, and thank you for arranging this.
Oh
Appreciate it.
no, thank you so much. All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and it's been a great experience, great learning experience.